Happy Christmas to you all. It's myself, Jonathan, also known as the PC Genie. Today we're going to be looking at, well, in terms of what sorts of weapons may or may not be effective in a hypothetical zombie apocalypse scenario. I'll be looking at, well, knives, of course.
I'm gonna have to confiscate your pinky.
Now, one of the first things I'd like to mention is that it's fairly important to look at what knives we're talking about, because although there are certain things that are useful in general to knives, it's important to have a look at the key differences between them as well. So I'll get to those in a minute, but perhaps to start with, let's have a look at some of the key concepts of knives. Now, obviously, although there's no strict definition of what's the different, what is the boundary between a long knife and a short sword, we all have a rough idea of what to expect from something like a proper sword and a little dicky knife. So of course, it does mean there is always the disadvantage of range. So, whenever you're using a knife, whether it's overhand or underhand, there's always a disadvantage that, and actually it's something that's very frequently mentioned when you look at Fiore de la Berry's manuals on dagger, is that you basically have to get into grappling range to use a knife. Now with those manuscripts, normally you're looking at different distances. You're looking at, maybe if you've got a sword, you'd be looking at what's called, I can't remember the exact names in Italian, but basically you've got your distance play and your close play. So you'd have out at a distance where you're doing your cuts and thrusts as you see fit, and of course your opponent either has to use something like a weapon against you, or they have to deliberately make some kind of cover or a bit of a risky charge to close in, ready to grapple, wrestle with you, try to take your weapon, maybe bite you, anything. Whereas with a knife, it is made clear in the manuscripts, and I do believe as well from practicing, that whenever you use a knife, it's a bit unique as a weapon in the fact that obviously it is a weapon. It's definitely better than being unarmed, unlike with some weapons. I've mentioned there are a couple of things which I think are worse than being unarmed, like using a... Actually, I won't tell you because you should watch the other videos. Sneaky me. Yes, with a knife, it is a good weapon. It's something that can be used, obviously. Some of them have cutting edges, so you can do various cuts, and even on something like a zombie, it doesn't matter if you feel pain or not. If you cut something like a tendon, or do something like open the jaw, as horrible and gory as that scene would be, the fact is you can still use those cuts to be disabling. You don't necessarily have to worry about whether an opponent screams in pain or whether they don't feel it at all. Physically disabling the body part, like it going inside the elbow or under the armpit or under the kneecap or whatever you're doing around the neck perhaps, to disable that part is still useful and still effective. So in that sense, having a good cutting edge and of course a good thrusting point on a knife allows you to do that much better than with your fists and feet. And it shows how good I am at kicks. I can't even lift my foot above my hip. But with these knives, there is always the danger of the fact that you have to remain in a grappling range. So in the distance where you can be doing stabs quite a lot, something like a zombie or even other human is at the distance where they can wrestle with you, or they can bite you or do something like that. It's a constant danger no matter what knife you're using. It's only when you get into larger weapons, well, like swords of course, or spears, or even projectile weapons, do you eliminate that danger. So that's something with all of the knives I'm going to show today, is a constant worry that you'd have to be concerned about whenever fighting a zombie. So hence, in that sense, because also, on the flip side of the coin, because it is such a short weapon, it also makes for an ideal sidearm. Granted, things like swords can often be considered sidearms as well, and same with things like knives, but it's useful for if you do have to get into a grappling range. So you could have a main weapon, maybe a firearm, maybe some other projectile weapon, maybe a two-handed sword, spear, or maybe you're just using your hands in general to, you know, do other things, lifting heavy objects, moving wheelbarrows, you know, pulling out barricades with a crowbar. It doesn't matter. The fact is, it's very easy to wear a knife on your side. I won't bore you by taking my belt off and putting this on, but it's a simple belt clip, so I can have it around the front here, easy access. Maybe I want to draw it like a sword, or I can have it behind me, and I've got all my hands free, and I can have other tools and items on my belt, and then if the emergency arises, I've got a knife. So it's extremely useful in that sense. So yeah, that's the sort of two sides of the double edge of the sword, so to speak. The fact that it's very portable, extremely portable, very useful, and can often be concealed if you're being more nefarious around other survivors and things, like having one of these in your pocket. Oh, la la la. Hi there. How are you today? Oh dear, you appear to be bleeding profusely. Hopefully you don't do that, by the way. But obviously there's that, but the close range, it's always a problem. So, let's have a look in terms of more specific knife types. So we might as well start with this. This is something I actually got for my 16th birthday. It's a folding knife. So it's the most portable of the styles. Personally, I'd recommend, although having something like a Swiss Army knife, one of those multi-tools, is quite useful. You know, especially in, well, tool purposes, especially with the other tools attached to them. Normally, although there are exceptions, they tend to have very short blades, as in we're talking an inch or less, very pitiful. And in a combat context, I'd say that's not at all recommended. At that point, well, maybe it is better than using your fists, but not much better, because you've got the puncturing capability, but you can't actually go deep enough to do much harm to any particular body part, which is a key problem. With something like this though, folding knife, I think it's got about 3.5 inch blade or something like that. I'll go up closer to the camera so you can see it. Here it is. As you can see, it's got this bit here. Sorry, wrong side. It's got this bit here for the thumb or fingernail. It's got a nice grip as well. I think it's very comfortable in the hand. So you see on these typical knife grips something like this, little ridges for individual fingers to fit into, or just things like this, general curvature, just to fit snugly into the hand in general. And in this case, a bit of a Hovis loaf, best of both. So of course, nice and comfortable in the grip, very easy to wield. You know, you don't even have to have your eyes open. You can have a feel of the knife, and you can have a good grip on it right from the start. And actually helps with the edge alignment, because you can actually feel where your hand is even if you don't see it. So in that sense, things like folding knives and other short knives, just in general, have a nice grip to them. So it makes them easy enough to use in your hand. But of course, they aren't that long. They're probably deep enough that you could pierce through something like an eye socket into the brain, into a heart. I think you only need about 3 inches through the chest and you get the heart. But I suppose it's alright, you know, for what it is. And of course, again, it's portable, so you could have even extra things like other sidearms, a sword, you could have spears and guns and other things, plus a knife. So in that sense, it's very useful as a +1 to everything else you'd have as your equipment. Next up, we have this. It's just your typical kitchen knife. Now there are two main types of kitchen knife I'd consider. Firstly, there are your proper sort of chef's knives. So they normally have a full tang, which is where the tang, for those of you who don't know, is the part of the blade that extends out into the handle. And normally on chef's knives, you tend to see a full tang, so it's sort of sandwiched between two slabs of plastic or wood, whatever makes up the handle's grip. And in that sense, they're more sturdy. You often see them with higher quality steel. They tend to be sharper, they tend to be more durable, so the edge retention is good. They tend not to bend and snap so easily. They're generally better quality. So given a choice between a cheaper or more expensive kitchen knife, there is a degree of price equals quality in there, even when you're not thinking about chopping up vegetables and meat, but actually using it for fighting purposes. But this example I've got here, I shall again give you a close-up. This is a cheap example. As you can see, it is made of stainless steel, so it does, well, with knives it's okay to have stainless steel. On something like a sword, it's going to be too brittle to use effectively. With knives you can get away with it, but there's still a problem in the fact that stainless steel is quite brittle. Of course, with stainless steel, you don't have to worry about rust and maintenance so much. You only really occasionally have to worry about sharpening the edge of the blade, whereas as opposed to having to worry about generally maintaining it and stopping it from crumbling into dust before you're finished using it. So that's a good thing about kitchen knives, but again, with cheap ones like this, they aren't as resilient. I have seen versions, some versions have what are called rat tail tangs, so they have a sort of a stick, well, not rat tail tang, sorry, more of a sort of a stick tang which extends into the handle, which is okay. It's not quite as durable as a full tang, and also not as reusable, because on a full tang, even if the actual scale parts fall off, you've still got, the actual metal bit. It's not comfortable, but you can still grip onto it, and you can still use it well. Whereas with one of these, if it falls out, you don't really have anything you can grip anymore until you spend the time to fix it to a new handle. And one key disadvantage, I think, even on these particular ones, which I think is, in fact it is, that's why I've only got this one and not the larger one, which is about this big, because I used it for a bit of experimentation on some inanimate targets, and it came apart. And this is something you need to watch out for on these types of knives, because if you see ones like this, basically what you see in front of the handle is pretty much the entirety of the blade. So what I mean is, you see all of this from the point going all the way down, around, into the handle. It doesn't then turn into a tang that extends out, it actually just continues along. So it's basically hanging by a thread. It only takes too strong a cut or a bit too much twisting going on in thrust, and then it'll just basically come apart. It won't snap or do anything dramatic, it just comes apart, detaches, blade from handle, and then it basically becomes almost useless at that point. So again, if you are going to have something like a kitchen knife, I recommend you get a good quality one, an old school full tang one, even if it's not as pretty looking. Now next up, we have this. Now this is a Scottish bollock dagger I got for my 18th birthday. That's why it's called bollock dagger. It's an interesting one. When you see grips like this, it's not as good for edge alignment because it's more rounded, so it's more inclined to twist around when you're doing any kind of cuts, or even when you're doing thrusts. It might sort of turn around in your hand if you haven't got a completely secure grip, which is why it's sometimes tempting to sort of put the finger over like this, or to sort of pinch it more like that, to try and stop it from doing that turning around, because you don't want that happening in a fight, because otherwise you could end up trying to thrust, it's twisting, and then it catches on some ribs, or even you're trying to do a cut, you're basically doing a flat slap going on instead of a proper chop and slice, which obviously I'm not going to demonstrate in my hand because I don't want to be in hospital. This is made of spring steel. Now spring steel, it's not, well, versions like this can be a bit cheaper, and same with other recreation daggers. They tend not to hold an edge that well, but their designs tend to be quite militaristic and are quite useful when fighting. So generally it's not bad, but again, you should always watch out and make sure you don't get stainless steel recreations, because they'll be very cheap and very brittle. at least get something that's a cheaper, basic carbon steel, or better still, high quality, high carbon steel like 1060 or 1080. Beyond that, we have got, finally, this, which is a hunting knife. It's by a brand called Nieto, N-I-E-T-O. I think it's, handcrafted in Spain for 40C, it says. In fact, I'll give you a close-up. Here we are. Now with these, one important thing to bear in mind is this, the handguard. Now of course, there's a very low chance you're ever going to be able to properly parry swords or do anything like that with something like this. However, it's very good for the thrust. Now if I take an earlier example, like this folding knife, and if I thrust, there's a good chance that it can end up stopping and going along and sliding, cutting my fingers. And actually, I had a friend of mine over who used one of my machetes, and because the handle isn't designed for thrusting, that actually happened to him, and we had to get plasters and bandage up his fingers, because he did the thrust at the target just to see if a machete could stab. It can't that well. His fingers slid along and it cut him open. That is something you don't want happening in an actual fight, and also if you're considering zombie blood on the knife, you don't want that inside you, for obvious reasons. So having something like one of these handguards is very, very, very useful, because then you can be thrusting along, and doesn't matter how much you're trying to push it along, there's not much chance that it'll slip on and start cutting you open. It also means you'll keep it in a good grip, as you're supposed to. Of course, same as before, with the folding knife, you see very ergonomic grip, and it's nice, it fits into the fingers, and because it has a more rectangular cross section, it helps you with edge alignment, so it's much better for cuts. And of course, it also helps you align your blade on thrust, so maybe trying to get in between ribs, up the neck, into an eye socket, something like that. So these, I'd say, are the best hunting knives because they're built as utility tools, so they'll deliberately make them good enough quality. And this is I told you it's a stainless knife blade. There, you can generally, whether it's stainless or high carbon steel, you tend to get better quality versions that are more useful for edge retention, of which this is good for it. You tend to get larger blades, which are quite useful in combat. They give you that extra bit of reach, and of course if you're thrusting, that extra bit of penetration. So it's generally the best type of combat blade you can get. So things like Bowie knives and things like that, especially when they've got these types of handguards, are the best in my opinion. So yes, all in all, I'd say that it's a bit of a mixed bag, unlike with the other weapons where I've given a definitive, it's a good weapon, it's a bad weapon. With these knives, it's more of an it depends. If you get something like a cheap kitchen knife that's not very well designed, it's going to be useless for you, pretty much. Well, maybe not useless, but it's going to be very unreliable and a bit too much of a gamble for you. Whereas if you get good quality, well-designed blade, it can serve you very well for many years, and of course act as your perfect backup when all else fails, because that's one of the best things about knives. I have to say it again, you can use it to complement other equipment, so then you don't have to choose, do I go for this spear or do I go for this sword? You know, it's the situation of I can have whatever of those main weapons and a knife at any time. Okay, so yes, hope you enjoyed this video, and see you later.